Hello, U.S. history students. This is a look at how to do an ID. There are 3 steps. First, you define the term or the person. Second, you provide historical context. And third, you link the ID to other terms. So let's do salutary neglect here for a second. The first thing you would do is define it. So we've talked about this a bunch before. It's the unofficial British policy of not strictly enforcing laws and taxes against the colonies. And don't just leave it there, like not say ignore the colonies. This is key here. As long as the colonies provide resources and some tax revenue and don't cause any problems. So here's the second part. Here's some historical context. So these are the first British colonies, and things go along pretty well for a while. And then what happened, the policy is salutary neglect. And this is when salutary neglect ends. Because of the French and Indian War, which runs from 1754 to 63. So here we have the French and Indian War, costs a lot of money, and now the colonies are causing problems. Before they weren't, so we could neglect them, but now the British can't neglect them anymore, and the British want tax money, so they start imposing all sorts of restrictions, such as the Proclamation Line of 1763, and then you go forward and define the Proclamation Line and also talk about some of the taxes that were happening at the time. So those are the 3 components to an ID. So what I asked you in class to do was do a review and make an ID of George Washington. So what are some things you could say about George Washington? Well, you probably have heard him called the father of our country before. You know he was a Revolutionary War general. He also presided over the Constitutional Convention in 1787 and was then unanimously elected president. You know he's our first president. He served 2 terms and set the precedent of only serving 2 terms. He set a whole bunch of other precedents as president, how to set up a cabinet, what the president should be addressed, all those sorts of things that people needed to figure out. On the domestic front, he put down the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794, and we can talk more about that, but basically it showed that the federal government had a lot more power than it did back when a similar sort of rebellion happened in Massachusetts. That would be Shays' Rebellion. And he issued the Proclamation of Neutrality in 1793, which, as we talked about in class, was controversial for 2 reasons. One, he didn't consult with the Senate, so he was seen as grabbing power. You're supposed to get 2/3 of the Senate to agree with treaties, according to the Constitution. And second, it left France out to dry. France had been our ally, and by being neutral between the war that was going on between France and Great Britain, people felt like we weren't being loyal to our ally, France. When his second term was done, he retired to Mount Vernon, again setting that precedent of only serving 2 terms. And but when he was president, he had slaves in Pennsylvania, and we talked in class about that and how if the slaves had been there for 6 months, he would have, under Pennsylvania law, they would have been free, and so he had to shuttle his slaves in and out of the state. So something like that, and fleshing out more of the details, would be a great ID. You wouldn't need all of that necessarily, but you should have, I would say, all but one of the items that are listed there. So let's look at an actual ID that someone did in class, and we'll just read it here. George Washington was a major political figure that helped to ignite a fire in the rebels' hearts that victory was attainable. So that's pretty good first sentence. This is an odd transition, saying it all started with the Whiskey Rebellion. I would strive for more chronology and, again, more historical context. So if you're talking about a person, you talk about what happened first in their life, and then second, and then third. So all this stuff about the Whiskey Rebellion, is good. The tax began in 1791, but the real rebellion was put down in 1794, and you should know that. And so this is good in here. It's a good description of the Whiskey Rebellion, but we want to go beyond just describing things and say why the Whiskey Rebellion was significant. And the significance of it is that unlike during Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, where there was no federal government to put down a rebellion of farmers, President Washington got 12 to 13,000 troops together and made it clear that if the federal government taxes you or taxes your whiskey, you are going to pay that tax. And that showed the strength of the federal government. So you want to make sure to do that. This ID then goes on to say that Washington was, or they should say, to be phrased differently, maybe Washington issued the Proclamation of Neutrality, a formal announcement that he put together declaring the nation neutral in the conflict between France and Great Britain. That's good. If you explain some of the context there, that's really good. And then it threatened legal proceedings against anybody providing assistance, so you can't help either side, so don't trade with either side, presumably. And here's the reason: Washington felt the U.S. was too weak. So that's really good. And then by being neutral, they agreed, this is sort of restating what was earlier there, we were on the sideline. And again, you want to say why this was a controversial decision, both because of the power grab, not consulting the Senate, and because people were concerned that France was left out to dry by Washington. But this has some good stuff in it. And let's see how it ends. So Washington was also the general that led us to victory, but also losses. He lost more battles than he won. This is good, but this should go before he becomes president, because he was the general during the Revolutionary War before he was our first president. And then it talks about, you can hit pause and read this here, but he was unanimously voted into office. And then these last two sentences say he accomplished a massive amount of changes that benefited the nation in more than a few ways. But you're not specifying any of those ways. And so that sentence really doesn't do any work. And similarly here, he helped to found the base of our country, ensuring that today we would still be free and powerful. How did he do that? What base are you talking about? When you do an ID, you need to include specifics. So this has some good stuff in it, but it needs to have all the components that we outlined at first. And so the ones that are missing are that he presided over the Constitutional Convention, and that's just a sentence that's easy to put in. Had the unanimous part, mentions that he served 2 terms, you've got the Whiskey Rebellion, Proclamation of Neutrality, and because we talked about it in class, and because I asked you specifically to address this in your ID, you should have mentioned the part about being a slave owner as well. But again, not a bad ID there for our first draft. And so as we move forward, we're going to want to see IDs that do all of these things here. Let's look at something another student wrote. So this ID was way too short, and I'll just read it to you. George Washington was an American political leader in the 18th century. That's good. He was a general in the Revolutionary War and later became the first president of the United States. That's great. But then it jumps to the whiskey tax, and there were protests, and Washington was forced to shut it down, and he also oversaw the Proclamation of Neutrality in 1783. Problem with this is it jumps right to him putting down the Whiskey Rebellion. It doesn't talk about him at the Constitutional Convention or being elected unanimously president. And then the problem here is it just mentions the Proclamation of Neutrality, but it doesn't define what it was or talk about any of the controversy surrounding it. So this would not be a strong ID, although it does raise a few good points. So let's look at this one here. George Washington was a U.S. statesman, general of the Revolutionary War, and first president of the United States. That's a great opening line. Good stuff. He was appointed commander-in-chief at the Continental Army. Revolutionary War ended with him defeating Cornwallis at Yorktown. So this is lots of good historical context here. And then when he resigned from the military, he moved to Mount Vernon, became a private citizen. And then it's got that he presided over the convention in Philadelphia. So that's really good stuff. And then it doesn't really talk about him setting any precedents at all. It just sort of jumps into the Proclamation of Neutrality. So maybe something about saying this was his foreign policy would be good in there. But that's accurate about what he did. Doesn't talk about the controversy, but that's pretty good to mention it. And then here's the Whiskey Rebellion happened. Again, folks have it beginning in 1791. The tax began then, but the real rebellion was in 1794. And then it doesn't talk about the significance of putting down the Whiskey Rebellion. So you want the significance to go here. So we now have a strong federal government, stronger than during Shays' rebellion. And then the last line here is Washington could have chosen to stay president for a while, but he resigned, not resided, but resigned after 2 terms of 4 years. So again, pretty good, but you want to go further and explain in more details some of the things, some of the related terms, don't just mention them, but say what the Proclamation of Neutrality was, why it was controversial, and explain the significance of the Whiskey Rebellion. So if you took those 3 IDs we just looked at and put them together, you could combine those and make one great ID. And this ID is really short, but it does have a good detail that we could add in. So George Washington was Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War, good. He was also the first president, good. He was a good leader and shows this when he steps down, when he could have become more king-like. That's one way he shows he's a good leader, when he shut down the Whiskey Rebellion by sending 13,000 soldiers. And I don't understand this last point here, made the roles of each branch more cut out. I think that refers to some of the early precedents he set. But again, the problem here is it's not defining what the Whiskey Rebellion is, and it's missing the Neutrality Proclamation. So again, whenever you get an ID, I think before you start writing on the exam, make an outline like this. So he's known as the father of our country, and then list the things that he did. And there are other details you may have beyond the ones that are on this list, but this is linking up to specifically the Whiskey Rebellion and to the Revolutionary War, and also to the Proclamation of Neutrality. So those are 3 other IDs or terms that you should think of when you're thinking of George Washington. And if you were describing the Whiskey Rebellion, for instance, you'd want to make sure to mention George Washington. Similarly, if you were asked to write about the Revolutionary War or about the Whiskey Rebellion, you would have to mention our good friend, George Washington. So I hope that is helpful. And if you have any questions, please let me know. You should try to write out turn this outline here into a full ID of George Washington. And that would be a good thing to have in your notes.